The town of Black Hollow was tucked away in the woods, a place most people forgot about. But those who lived there never forgot the stories. They had grown up hearing whispers of things in the forest, things no one should dare look for. Evelyn had never believed the tales, but she was about to learn the hard way that some stories are more than just folklore. It was a bitter autumn night when Evelyn and her friends decided to camp near Black Hollow Ridge, right on the edge of the vast, untouched forest. The air was still, and an eerie fog clung to the trees like ghostly fingers. The group gathered around a flickering campfire, laughing and sharing urban legends to pass the time. But when the topic turned to the Skinwalker, a shape-shifting creature that mimicked voices and stole faces, the laughter quieted. "They say it looks like someone you know, but not quite," Brandon said, his face lit by the dim firelight. "Like it's wearing their skin but doesn't know how to act human." "Bullshit," Evelyn scoffed. "It's just another story to scare kids." "I don't know," Natalie murmured. "My grandma swore she saw one when she was young, said it called out to her using my grandpa's voice, even though he was already dead." The wind seemed to pick up just then, making the trees creak and groan. Evelyn shivered, but blamed it on the cold. As the night wore on, the fire began to die. Evelyn decided to wander into the woods to gather more firewood. The thick canopy above blocked out the moon, and soon she was engulfed in shadows. She could hear her friends faintly laughing behind her as she pushed deeper into the forest. Then came the sound, a soft rustling in the bushes to her left. "Evelyn," a voice whispered, so faint she almost missed it. She froze. It sounded like her mother's voice. But how? Her mother was hundreds of miles away, and this wasn't her voice exactly. It was off, too low, too distant, like a faded memory trying to come back to life. "Evelyn," it called again, now closer, insistent. She turned and saw a figure standing just at the edge of the clearing. It was her mother, but no, the figure was wrong. Its posture too stiff, eyes too wide, and skin stretched tight like an ill-fitting mask. Its smile was all teeth, too large for its face. Her heart raced. This wasn't her mother. It was something else, something pretending. Without thinking, she turned and bolted back toward the camp. Branches whipped at her face, but she didn't care. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her, growing faster, closer. When she stumbled into the clearing, breathless, her friends looked up in alarm. "What happened?" Brandon asked, rising to his feet. It's here," Evelyn panted, clutching her chest. "The Skinwalker. It's in the woods. I saw it." Brandon's face paled. "Are you sure?" Before she could answer, a rustling came from the tree line. They all turned toward the sound. Out of the shadows stepped another, Evelyn. It looked exactly like her, same clothes, same wild, panicked eyes. But its movements were jerky, unnatural. The real Evelyn backed away slowly as the imposter grinned, the skin around its lips stretching too far, revealing rows of sharp, yellow teeth. "Don't look away," the real Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. "It can't take you if you keep your eyes on it." Her friends were frozen in terror, their gazes locked on the creature that had stolen her face. The two Evelyns stood side by side, one real, one a twisted mockery. For what felt like hours, no one moved. The imposter didn't blink, its hollow eyes fixed on them all, its mouth still stretched into that horrible, unnatural smile. Then, in a flash, it darted forward, faster than anything human. Natalie screamed as it lunged at Brandon, grabbing him with clawed hands, ripping at his skin as though trying to peel it off. Evelyn's friends scattered, but she couldn't move. The thing looked at her with her face, and for a moment it almost seemed to enjoy the terror it caused. "Evelyn," it whispered, in a voice that wasn't hers anymore. With a sickening, twisting movement, the Skinwalker bent and ripped away Brandon's face with a wet, tearing sound. Blood sprayed the trees, and the thing stood there, wearing his skin now, grinning with Brandon's face, but those same dead eyes. Evelyn screamed, finally breaking free of her paralysis, and sprinted into the woods. Her heart thundered in her chest as she ran blindly, branches slashing at her arms and face. Behind her, she heard it mimicking Brandon's voice now. "Evelyn, wait, come back." The voice was too close. She didn't stop until she reached the highway, where she collapsed, trembling and covered in blood that wasn't hers. When the police arrived, they found no trace of her friends, no bodies, just empty tents in the eerie quiet of the woods. Black Hollow Ridge would soon become another place of whispered warnings, another story parents told their children. But Evelyn would always remember the last words she heard from the creature. Brandon's voice warped and hollow as it called to her from the shadows. "I'll be seeing you soon." The village of Thornwood had always been quiet. Nestled deep within an ancient forest, it was the kind of place where people kept to themselves and old superstitions held more weight than reason. No one ventured into the woods at night, not unless they wanted to meet the Watcher.
Elena had lived there her whole life, hearing the same warnings from her parents, her grandparents, and the town elders. Stay out of the woods after dark, and never, under any circumstances, look the watcher in the eyes. For most of her life, she listened, but as she grew older, curiosity began to take hold. What could possibly be so dangerous in those woods? What was the watcher really? An old myth meant to scare kids? She had never seen anything strange. That was about to change. One chilly autumn evening, Elena and her friend Mark dared each other to venture past the tree line, just a little further than anyone had gone in years. They were both skeptical, but excited, the adrenaline of breaking the village's one unspoken rule pushing them forward. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the forest floor. "I don't get why everyone's so scared," Mark said, stepping over a fallen branch. "These are just trees. There's no creepy creature out here." Elena laughed nervously. "Yeah, well, let's not get too cocky. You've heard the stories." "They're just stories, Elena." But as they walked deeper, the atmosphere shifted. The air felt heavier, colder, and the trees seemed to crowd in around them. Elena's heart began to pound in her chest. She was about to suggest turning back when Mark stopped dead in his tracks. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Elena strained her ears, but at first, there was nothing, just the eerie silence that hung over the woods like a shroud. But then, softly, almost too faint to notice, came a sound, a soft, slow rustling, as if something, or someone, was moving through the leaves nearby. "Maybe it's an animal," Elena suggested, though she didn't believe her own words. There was something wrong with that sound. It wasn't random, like the noise of a squirrel or a deer. It was methodical, deliberate. Mark turned, his eyes wide. "We should go." They both began to walk back the way they had come, but the rustling followed, growing louder, closer. Panic surged through Elena as she quickened her pace, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds. That's when she saw it, a shadow, tall, impossibly thin, and too far away to make out any features, but it was there, standing between the trees, watching. "Mark," she hissed, grabbing his arm. "Look." Mark turned, his face paling as he too saw the figure. "Run," he breathed. They bolted through the trees, their footsteps pounding against the forest floor. The rustling grew louder, faster, as if whatever was following them wasn't just walking. It was gliding through the woods, chasing them without ever breaking stride. Elena's lungs burned, her legs screamed in protest, but she didn't dare stop. The watcher was right behind them. She could feel it. Then suddenly, Mark stopped. "Elena," he whispered, his voice shaky. "What are you doing?" she gasped, grabbing his arm. "We have to keep going." But Mark didn't move. He was staring straight ahead, his eyes wide with terror, frozen in place. Slowly, Elena turned to see what he was looking at. The watcher stood before them. Its body was cloaked in darkness, a shadow that flickered unnaturally in the dim light. Its face, if you could call it that, was hidden behind a veil of shadow, but its eyes were glowing, twin orbs of pale, sickly light that seemed to pierce through the night. Elena's breath caught in her throat. The warnings echoed in her mind. Never look the watcher in the eyes, but it was too late. The moment she locked eyes with the creature, she felt something shift inside her, like her very soul was being pulled toward it. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her body wouldn't move. The watcher's eyes bore into hers, and suddenly, everything around her blurred. The trees, the ground, even Mark beside her began to melt away, leaving only darkness. And then came the whispers, thousands of them, all around her, like voices from the grave. "Join us. Come closer. Let us in." The voices grew louder, more frantic, clawing at her mind. She could feel something crawling under her skin, like invisible hands tugging at her, trying to pull her into the dark void the watcher had come from. "Elena!" Mark's voice broke through the haze, pulling her back. She blinked and gasped, the forest rushing back into focus. She turned to see him struggling to pull her away from the watcher, his face pale with fear. "We have to go," he shouted, tugging her arm. Elena stumbled, her legs weak and unsteady, but she managed to move. They didn't stop running until they burst out of the woods and collapsed onto the village road, panting and trembling.
For a long time, neither of them spoke. They lay there, staring up at the stars, trying to process what had just happened. The watcher had let them go, but why? Finally, Mark broke the silence. "We're never going back there, ever." Elena nodded, still feeling the cold weight of those glowing eyes watching from the trees. They had escaped, but she knew the watcher hadn't forgotten them. It never did. Weeks passed, and Elena tried to forget the encounter, but the feeling of being watched never left her. Sometimes at night, she would catch a glimpse of a shadow at the edge of the trees, always just out of sight. And then came the whispers. They started soft, barely noticeable, but grew louder each night. "Join us." One evening, she couldn't take it anymore. She ran to her window and threw it open, screaming into the darkness, "Leave me alone." The whispers stopped, but from the woods, she heard a rustle, and a voice that wasn't her own, soft and full of malice, whispered back, "We're always watching." And somewhere in the distance, the glowing eyes of the watcher blinked once in the dark, then vanished into the night. It was said that Hollow Creek was cursed. No one knew exactly when the curse had started, but for as long as anyone in town could remember, the creek that wound through the dark forest carried with it stories of strange happenings. The locals never fished there, never swam, and certainly never ventured near it after sundown. But 16-year-old Jessica didn't believe in curses. Her friends had spent years daring each other to spend the night by the creek, but no one had ever followed through, except her. It was a dare, plain and simple. She was going to prove that there was nothing to be afraid of. So one crisp autumn night, Jessica packed a small bag, grabbed her flashlight, and set off toward Hollow Creek. The moon was full, casting long silvery beams through the trees as she walked. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, and the sound of the creek's gentle flow could be heard in the distance. When she arrived, she found a spot near the water to set up camp. She laid out a blanket, sat down, and took a deep breath. It was quiet, too quiet. No crickets, no owls, just the faint gurgle of the water and the rustling of leaves in the wind. "Nothing scary about this place at all," Jessica muttered to herself, trying to shake off the creeping feeling of unease that had started to settle in her stomach. But as the hours dragged on and darkness fully enveloped the forest, she began to feel watched. She told herself it was just her mind playing tricks on her, but then she heard it, a splash in the creek. She froze, straining to hear. The splash had been subtle, like something or someone had moved through the water. Her heart began to race as she clicked on her flashlight and shone it toward the creek. Nothing. The water flowed lazily under the moonlight, undisturbed. She let out a shaky breath and laughed at herself. But then there was another splash, this time louder, closer. Jessica stood up, her flashlight trembling in her hand. She slowly approached the creek, the beam of light darting across the water's surface. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. No answer, but she could feel it now. The air around her had grown colder, the kind of cold that sank deep into your bones, the kind that didn't belong to a mild autumn night. And then she saw it, a figure standing in the creek. It was barely visible at first, just a shadow in the mist that had begun to rise off the water. But as she stared, the figure became clearer, slowly taking shape. It was a woman. Her hair hung wet and limp, her clothes clinging to her body, as if she had just crawled out of the creek. Jessica's heart stopped. The woman's head was bowed, her face obscured by her tangled hair, and her arms hung lifelessly at her sides. The water rippled around her feet, even though she wasn't moving. Are you okay?" Jessica managed to choke out, though her instincts were screaming at her to run. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she slowly began to lift her head. Jessica's flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering as the figure's face came into view. The woman's skin was pale, too pale, like she had been submerged in water for days. Her eyes were black pits, hollow and empty, and her mouth was stretched into an unnatural, wide grin, a smile that seemed to split her face in two. Jessica's scream caught in her throat as the woman started to move. No, not move. She floated across the water, coming toward her without ever touching the ground. Her body seemed weightless, gliding over the surface of the creek like a ghost. Jessica turned and ran. The trees blurred past her as she sprinted through the forest, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound of her own footsteps was drowned out by the rushing of the creek behind her, the water roaring as if it were alive, chasing her. But it wasn't just the water. She could hear the woman's laughter now, a low, guttural sound that echoed through the trees, growing louder with every step. It was coming from everywhere, surrounding her, closing in. Jessica's lungs burned as she pushed herself to run faster, but no matter how far she ran, the laughter followed. It felt like the woman was right behind her, her cold, wet breath brushing the back of Jessica's neck. Just when she thought she couldn't run any further, the trees parted, and she stumbled into the clearing where her car was parked. She fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking violently as she tried to unlock the door. The laughter was deafening now, almost as if it were coming from inside her head. Finally, she managed to unlock the door, throwing herself into the driver's seat. She slammed the door shut and locked it, her entire body trembling. For a moment, there was silence. She sat there, breathing heavily, staring into the darkness of the woods, half expecting to see the woman standing there, grinning at her from the shadows. But there was nothing. just the quiet hum of the engine and the soft rustling of the leaves in the wind. Jessica let out a long, shaky breath, trying to steady herself. Maybe it had all been in her head. Maybe the stories had just gotten to her. But then, slowly, from the back seat, came a wet, raspy whisper. "Why did you leave me?" Jessica's blood ran cold. She didn't dare turn around, but she could feel it. Her sitting just behind her, soaking the back seat with water. The last thing Jessica heard before the world went black was the sound of the woman's laughter, low and hollow, as cold, wet hands wrapped around her neck. The next morning, Jessica's car was found abandoned at the edge of the forest. The driver's seat was empty, and the back seat was soaked with water, but there was no sign of her. The townspeople would whisper of Hollow Creek's latest victim, another soul lost to the cursed waters, the curse that no one dared question anymore. If you listen closely at night near the creek, some say you can still hear her, the woman who calls out from the water, waiting for someone else to make the same mistake, waiting to drag them down into the depths of Hollow Creek, just like she had done so many times before.